The hallway echoed with an unnatural silence broken only by the click of the principal's shoes and the sniffles of a girl too young to understand bureaucracy, but old enough to recognize injustice. 6-year-old Tessa Ellis walked stiffly beside him, eyes red but unwavering, her backpack bouncing slightly with every step, its fabric covered in her hand-drawn sketches of German shepherds. "You're expelled," the principal had said, his voice not cruel, but final. Behind her, a classroom of stunned children and teachers stood frozen, their gazes like tiny verdicts. Just minutes earlier, that same classroom had buzzed with anticipation. Victor Sullivan, a decorated Marine, had arrived for the Veterans Day presentation, his shoulders stooped, but his voice steady. By his side was Zeus, a commanding German shepherd with alert, watchful eyes. Tessa had been in the front row, eager, clutching her sketchbook. Victor spoke of battles both abroad and inside his own mind, and of how Zeus could sense his panic before even he could. The children gasped in awe as Zeus demonstrated obedience commands and pressed against Victor's legs when he wavered. But then the classroom door opened. Health Inspector Davis stepped in, clipboard clutched like a weapon. His eyes locked on Zeus. Animals aren't allowed on school grounds. He barked, old wounds bleeding through protocol memories of his daughter's mauling by a German shepherd 2 years prior. Principal Warren, a former Army captain turned rigid school leader, tried to mediate. But Davis's fear surged. "Remove the dog, or I file an emergency citation." The room tensed. Victor's breath quickened. His hands trembled. Zeus moved closer, pressed tight. A trained response. But the sight of the dog in action only triggered Davis further. Then Tessa stepped forward. Her voice was small but clear, shaking only slightly. "Service dogs are allowed anywhere. That's the law. You wouldn't take away someone's wheelchair." The room fell still. Principal Warren's face darkened. She'd crossed a line, not with disrespect, but with truth that pressed too close to his own hidden grief. His voice broke sharp through the silence. "You're expelled. Clear out your desk." Tessa didn't cry, not until the doors closed behind her. Then, alone on the school steps, she wiped her face and began the long walk home. Tessa's shoes scraped against the pavement as she passed familiar corners that suddenly felt foreign. Her backpack, filled with crayons and folded paper, felt heavier with every step, like it carried not just supplies, but the weight of her choices. She didn't understand everything about laws or schools or men in uniforms, but she knew what she saw: a man hurting, a dog helping, and adults too tangled in fear to see either clearly. At home, her grandfather's rocking chair would be waiting. George Ellis, a Vietnam veteran with a chest full of medals and eyes clouded by memory, was usually there by the window when she came back from school. His PTSD had quieted since Tessa moved in, her presence a steady hand against the tremors of the past. He had taught her about military codes, about bravery, and most importantly, about loyalty. That's how she'd known in that moment, standing between the dog and the clipboard, that Zeus wasn't just a dog. He was someone's lifeline, just like her grandfather had been for his unit long ago. But she hadn't expected to be alone afterward. Her drawings hadn't saved her. Her knowledge hadn't protected her. And now, the town was watching. Whispers followed her through the square. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery paused mid-kneading. Mr. Thompson at the hardware store frowned behind a broom. She heard her name spoken like a problem, rather than a person. Drawn by instinct, Tessa drifted toward the Veterans Memorial Park, the names etched in granite. Captain Samuel Ellis and Lieutenant Jennifer Ellis were her parents. She traced the cold letters with her finger. "I tried to be brave," she whispered to the stone. She didn't notice the black SUV idling across the street. Inside sat Colonel Daniel Harper, a man who had served with her parents. He had come to Millfield to deliver a posthumous medal, but now found himself watching a small girl defend a man, a law, and a legacy. Harper saw what most had missed: the straight posture, the clenched fists, the quiet defiance of a child who'd already lived through too much. And with that, he opened the car door. Tessa sat on the park bench, beneath the fluttering flag, her legs swinging, barely brushing the ground. The names of the fallen loomed quietly behind her, carved in granite that didn't flinch. She didn't hear the crunch of footsteps on gravel until the tall man in the crisp dress blues stopped a few feet away. "Miss Ellis." His voice was calm, with the steady weight of someone used to command. Tessa looked up, startled. She recognized the uniform from her grandfather's closet, though this man wore more medals. She stood quickly, her small frame instinctively straightening. "Sir," she replied. "I'm Colonel Daniel Harper," he said. "I served with your parents in Afghanistan." Her throat caught. She nodded and sat when he motioned gently to the bench. He didn't push. Instead, he waited. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered, but grew steadier with each sentence. She told him about the classroom, about Zeus, about Victor's panic, about how her grandfather had taught her that service dogs were heroes too, not pets. Colonel Harper listened, eyes narrowed, not with judgment, but with focus. When she spoke of Principal Warren's anger, her voice faltered. "I didn't mean to be rude, but when I mentioned my dad, he got so mad." "You weren't wrong," Harper said quietly. "And I believe your parents would be proud of you for standing your ground." That's when the tears came, not loud, frightened ones like earlier, but quiet drops of relief. Someone finally understood. He stood. "I think your grandfather needs to hear this from us. Would you let me drive you home?" She hesitated, but something about the way he stood, the weight of responsibility in his eyes, reminded her of her father. She nodded. As they walked to the vehicle, townsfolk watched. Mrs. Peterson stopped dusting her bakery counter. Mr. Thompson's broom paused mid-sweep. Within minutes, Millfield's whisper network crackled to life. By the time Harper buckled her into the front seat, the town already knew the Ellis girl had been picked up by a government SUV, and the story was no longer hers, alone. The drive to Maple Street was short, but each block felt like a chapter, turning in a story far larger than Tessa could grasp. Colonel Harper's silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent, as if carrying an unspoken duty. When they pulled into the driveway, George Ellis was already on the porch, rising slowly from his rocking chair, squinting through cataracts at the approaching vehicle. Tessa ran to him, burying her face into the flannel folds of his coat. His hands trembled as he held her. Inside, the modest home lined with military photos, and the scent of old wood held space for what came next. The colonel spoke gently, recounting what had happened: Tessa's expulsion, the confrontation, the law she had defended. George said little, but his jaw clenched tighter with each word. By the time she finished, his chest was rising unevenly, the tremor in his hand worsening. "Grandpa," she whispered. Colonel Harper saw it, instantly labored, breath clammy skin. He reached for his phone. "He needs medical attention. Now." Tessa rushed to fetch the medication shelf she'd organized herself. Minutes later, paramedics arrived. As they loaded George onto the stretcher, one paused beside Tessa. "He's in good hands," he said gently. But when asked who would stay with her, the moment darkened. "I'll stay," said Harper, flashing his ID, "until family arrives." The paramedic nodded. Tessa watched the ambulance disappear, feeling like she'd been left at the center of a storm she couldn't see. That night, word of her expulsion had reached the Millfield Gazette. Victor Sullivan, too, shaken to remain silent, had gone straight to the newsroom where his cousin worked. He spoke carefully with Zeus by his side and offered a simple truth. A little girl did what most adults wouldn't. She stood up. By morning, headlines spread through diners, inboxes, and breakfast tables. Local hero's granddaughter, expelled for defending service dog. In small towns, stories don't stay local for long. By sunrise, Millfield wasn't just buzzing, it was boiling. The story had spread from neighborhood gossip to full-blown controversy. Veterans groups, local news crews, and political hopefuls latched onto it like kindling in dry brush. Mayor candidate Roberts held an impromptu rally near Veterans Memorial Park, vowing to defend our heroes and their four-legged guardians. His opponent countered with a public forum on school safety and the boundaries of student conduct. Meanwhile, Jefferson Elementary fractured under the pressure. Parents pulled students from class. Teachers whispered in the faculty lounge. The principal, Robert Warren, found himself summoned to the superintendent's office to explain his decision to expel a 6-year-old girl whose only crime was invoking federal law. At Millfield General Hospital, George Ellis lay unconscious, his heart failing to withstand the weight of what had happened. Doctors stabilized him, but the prognosis was fragile. Colonel Harper kept vigil at his side, fielding calls from military contacts, reporters, and education officials. Tessa visited daily carrying her drawings mostly of Zeus, trying to cheer the only person left who felt like home. Elsewhere, doors quietly closed in Tessa's face. Every elementary school in the area declined her transfer. "We don't want to get involved," one principal said, his voice brittle with fear. Even Riverside Elementary, miles away, refused. Too much press, too much liability. Tessa became radioactive, Colonel Harper, sensing the isolation building in her, like a silent pressure valve, made inquiries. Harrison Military Preparatory Academy, a private school in Riverside, agreed to take her. "They work with therapy dogs and veterans," he explained gently. "You might like that." Tessa nodded slowly, unsure. Her fingers clutched the hem of her shirt as if to anchor herself. She wanted to stay near her grandfather. She didn't want to become someone else's project. But mostly she just wanted Zeus to be okay. Before she could decide, another wave hit. A national news crew arrived at the hospital. They weren't there for George Ellis's health. They were there for Tessa, the girl who stood up when adults didn't. What had started as a school rule violation had become a national referendum on courage, compassion, and the cost of silence. The story wasn't fading, it was catching fire. Victor Sullivan, struggling with the attention, found himself flooded with messages from veterans nationwide. Some praised him. Others shared their own battles to keep service dogs by their side in hospitals, airports, schools. The attention stirred old ghosts. His anxiety grew, and Zeus stayed closer than ever, a silent shield. At the hospital, George Ellis stabilized, but remained under close observation. He listened quietly as Harper explained the media storm. The colonel had pieced together a web of past connections. Victor and Principal Warren had served in the same Gulf War unit. And more poignantly, Warren's son had died under the command of Tessa's father, Captain Samuel Ellis. The same ambush that took Tessa's parents had taken Warren's son. "There's guilt here," George Harper said. "Maybe grief too. But your granddaughter is caught in it, and she shouldn't be." George's expression didn't shift, but his hand tightened around the hospital sheet. Tessa's paid enough. The town around them reflected that fracture. Local businesses chose sides, some posting signs reading "service dog friendly," others displaying "safety first." Neighbors stopped talking to each other. At Jefferson Elementary, staff felt the tension like a tremor under their feet. Mrs. Johnson, Tessa's former teacher, was reprimanded for sending homework to the expelled child and resigned. The school board, under pressure from veterans organizations and the media, called an emergency meeting for Tuesday evening. The auditorium filled with folding chairs. Protesters gathered outside, some with dogs in vests, others with picket signs and baby strollers. The tension wasn't just political, it was personal, soaked in fear and sorrow. Colonel Harper continued his quiet coordination. Behind the scenes, he arranged for Tessa to meet a child psychologist experienced with military families. The girl who once sparkled with quiet kindness now barely spoke shadows, gathering behind her eyes. She visited her grandfather each day, drawings clutched like offerings. Her smile, once automatic, came only when George managed to say, "That one looks like Zeus." But she hadn't heard the worst yet, because while Tessa was being considered for reinstatement, Zeus was being targeted. Tuesday night. The Jefferson Elementary Auditorium had never held this many people. The air vibrated with whispers and the static hum of news cameras. Veterans in uniform lined the walls. Parents clutched folded statements. A row of folding chairs sagged under the weight of tension. Local officers stood by the exits just in case. Superintendent Margaret Phillips opened the session with practiced composure. "We are here," she said, to address the incident involving Tessa Ellis, Principal Warren, and our policy on service animals. First to speak, Principal Robert Warren. He adjusted his tie and stepped to the mic, voice taut. "Order must be maintained," he said. "While I respect our veterans, Miss Ellis defied protocol. Her actions were insubordinate." Murmurs rippled across the room, some supportive, many not. Then Victor Sullivan stood. Zeus, calm and focused, padded quietly beside him. "This isn't about special treatment," Victor said. "It's about law. Zeus isn't a pet. He's medically necessary." He described the moment in the classroom, the panic rising, the room spinning, and Zeus grounding him. "What message do we send children if we punish someone for honoring that?" Then he turned directly to Principal Warren. "Your son served under Tessa's father. The same ambush took both. What you're doing isn't about rules. It's about grief." The auditorium gasped. Warren's face drained of color. He sat motionless. Next came Health Inspector Davis. His voice was shaky. 2 years ago, a German shepherd nearly killed my daughter," he confessed. "When I saw Zeus, I didn't see a service dog. I saw that dog." He paused. "I let fear cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry." The room softened. Some nodded. Others simply looked down. Then Tessa. Colonel Harper helped her to the podium, placing a booster so she could reach the mic. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "My mom and dad died serving our country. They told me to stand up for what's right." She looked toward Warren. "I'm sorry if I made you mad. My grandpa says, sometimes when people get mad, they're just really sad." A silence swept the room, then a standing ovation. Veterans clapped first, then parents, then the students sitting near the back. And yet the evening was far from over, because Harper hadn't spoken yet. When Colonel Harper approached the podium, silence fell like a gavel. He stood tall, in full-dress uniform medals, catching the auditorium light. "I came to Millfield to deliver a posthumous Silver Star to George Ellis," he began. "But I found his granddaughter carrying the same courage her parents once did." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Harper laid out the federal protections under the ADA. He cited case law. He explained how service dogs like Zeus are medical equipment, not pets. Tessa's expulsion, he said plainly, was not only unjust, it may have been illegal. He paused, then delivered the final blow. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs is now monitoring this situation. Federal investigators are prepared to intervene." The weight of those words landed hard. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others paled. And then, just as Harper stepped back, the auditorium doors opened. George Ellis, pale, frail, oxygen tank in tow, was wheeled into the room. The murmurs swelled into shock. Tessa leapt from the stage and ran into his arms, tears springing to her eyes. "I've survived 2 wars and a heart attack," George said, voice shaky but resolute. "I can survive a school board meeting." The crowd chuckled softly. "I taught my granddaughter to stand up for others. If that's a reason to expel her, maybe we've lost track of what we're teaching." He looked directly at Principal Warren. "Robert, your son died beside my son. Both believed in protecting others. Is this how we honor their sacrifice?" The words broke something open. Principal Warren stood trembling slightly. "I've spent years trying to create perfect order, as if enough rules could stop the chaos that took my son." His voice cracked. When Tessa mentioned her father, it brought everything back. "I wasn't reacting to her. I was reacting to my pain." He bowed his head. "I owe her an apology." Superintendent Phillips, recognizing the emotional threshold, called a recess. But no one left. Instead, a quiet scene unfolded. Warren knelt beside George Ellis, speaking softly to Tessa. She nodded, then hesitantly smiled. The war, it seemed, might finally be ending. The school board reconvened, but outside the protests had changed shape. Veterans with service dogs stood in silent formation, lining the sidewalks in solidarity. Opposing protesters, those concerned with school safety, stood across the street, their numbers smaller, now quieted by Davis's earlier testimony. Local news gave way to national coverage. Inside, everyone waited for resolution. Superintendent Phillips read aloud the board's emergency resolution. Tessa's expulsion would be rescinded. All disciplinary records expunged. Jefferson Elementary would institute a mandatory curriculum on service animals and form a veteran-inclusive advisory committee. The final surprise. Principal Warren, in a quiet act of penance, requested a temporary leave of absence to reflect on the personal grief that had bled into professional judgment. Applause swept the room. Outside, what had been a protest shifted into something gentler, a candlelight vigil. Veterans and townsfolk alike lit small flames in honor of the fallen Tessa's parents, Warren's son, and all who had sacrificed. It was quiet, unified if only briefly. As George was wheeled from the building, Tessa nestled in his lap. Cameras flashed, reporters called their names, but Harper shielded them from the frenzy. Before they reached the waiting vehicle, Zeus stepped forward, breaking protocol just once, to gently nuzzle Tessa's hand. That single moment, captured by a dozen cameras, became the image seen around the country. A girl, a dog, and a promise kept. But the morning after brought a chill. Animal Control arrived at Victor Sullivan's apartment with official papers. A parent had filed a formal complaint. Zeus was to be seized for mandatory evaluation and quarantine. Victor panicked. He clutched Zeus's harness like a lifeline. "He's not a pet," he rasped. "He's medical equipment." The officer, kind but bound by law, gave him 1 hour. By noon, Victor was hospitalized after suffering a severe panic attack, his first in years. And once again, the storm found Tessa. News of Zeus's seizure spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. By early afternoon, protesters gathered outside the animal control facility. Handwritten signs screamed across the barricades, "Free Zeus and service dogs save lives." Inside, Zeus waited in a cage he didn't understand, separated from the man he was trained to protect. Tessa had been scheduled to return to Jefferson Elementary that day. She never made it. When she learned about Zeus, her cries were sharp and ragged. "He helps Mr. Sullivan breathe," she sobbed to Mrs. Winters, her elderly caretaker. "What if he stops breathing without him?" No one had a good answer. At the hospital, George Ellis's blood pressure spiked dangerously upon hearing the news. Doctors increased his medication and barred visitors, including Tessa, for 24 hours. Another shock like this, warned Dr. Reynolds could be fatal. Colonel Harper added it to his growing list of emergencies. Victor Sullivan, meanwhile, was admitted to the psychiatric unit, gripped by a panic attack so severe he no longer recognized the hospital staff. The separation from his service animal, one doctor wrote, constitutes a negligent disruption of medical care. The statement leaked and added fresh fuel to the already raging fire. Tessa returned to school the next day, under the board's resolution, found no welcome waiting. Some parents had instructed their children to avoid her. Others simply withdrew their kids altogether. On the playground, she stood alone, ignored, avoided, whispered about. "My mom says you made the principal leave," one boy muttered before running away. At lunch, no one sat near her. She picked at her tray untouched. That afternoon, Mrs. Winters called Harper with trembling urgency. "She's packing her backpack," she said, with her grandfather's old military photos. "She says she's running away to find Zeus." Harper closed his eyes. The battle wasn't over. It had only changed shape, and Tessa, brave as ever, was still alone in the center of it. Tuesday dawned heavy over Millfield. Satellite trucks lined Main Street. Reporters swarmed sidewalks, interviewing anyone remotely connected to the unfolding crisis. In cafes and barbershops, every conversation circled back to the girl, the dog, the expulsion, and what the town had become. At the same time, Colonel Harper received two urgent messages. One from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs was watching. The other from Principal Warren, a request for a private meeting. No cameras. Inside Jefferson Elementary, the walls of the auditorium strained against the flood of attendees. Teachers, parents, veterans, even children, all packed in. The meeting stretched past 3 hours, and still tensions refused to loosen. Midway through the session, a new twist. A group of elementary students pushed forward, led by a determined third grader named Amy Phillips, the superintendent's daughter. Against protocol, she took the mic. "We want Tessa back," she said plainly. "We wrote letters." She held up a bundle of paper crayon drawings, lopsided handwriting, and raw truth only children could write. "She's our friend. Zeus is a good dog. It's not fair." Their words sliced through the fog of politics and policy. Adults leaned forward. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply listened, maybe for the first time. But as the meeting neared its peak, another clash brewed outside. Veterans tried to bring their service dogs into the auditorium, citing ADA protections. Police formed a buffer. Tensions mounted. What began as a vigil now threatened to unravel into confrontation. Then came the final message. Colonel Harper received a text. Urgent. He leaned toward George Ellis, still fragile, still resolute, and whispered. Then he stepped forward. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs has issued a statement," Harper announced. "If this board does not reach resolution tonight, federal investigators will arrive by morning." A collective breath caught in the room. It wasn't just about Tessa anymore. It was about law, about legacy, about whether Millfield could heal or break apart for good. The school board recessed briefly behind closed doors. Outside, reporters murmured predictions while candles flickered under the dusk. Inside, tension curled around every whispered conversation. When the board returned, Superintendent Phillips read the decision. Tessa's expulsion would be fully reversed. Her record cleared. Jefferson Elementary would implement mandatory education on service animals. A new advisory committee, including veterans, would review all policies affecting disabled individuals and military families. Then came the final surprise. Principal Warren stepped forward. "I support this resolution," he said quietly. "And I'll take a leave of absence to reflect on how grief clouded my judgment." Applause rang through the room, but even as the meeting ended, shadows lingered. Just hours later, Victor Sullivan remained hospitalized. Zeus was still caged, and Tessa, though vindicated, now carried scars that didn't show. As the Ellis family exited through a side door, camera flashes lit their path. Harper shielded them, but couldn't stop the chaos entirely. That's when Zeus appeared. Allowed brief release for a supervised visit, he trotted toward Tessa and gently pressed his snout into her hand. A gesture of gratitude, protection, recognition. It was captured by every lens in the room. That single moment. The girl, the dog, the quiet reunion became the image that would define a national debate. But peace was fleeting. By morning, reality returned. Zeus still faced mandatory quarantine. Victor's condition remained unstable. Tessa returning to school was still a pariah among her peers, her courage reframed as controversy. On the playground, she stood alone, too tired to fight, too loyal to give in. Later that day, Colonel Harper sat in his SUV reviewing it all. One girl, one dog, 2 generations of war and silence colliding in a single act of defiance. Then his phone rang. George Ellis was asking to speak with him. His voice was low, urgent. "I've made a decision about Tessa's future," he said. "And it's time we gave her more than just applause."